What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I want to talk about the state of the flyweight division because on the one hand, you'd expect it to be terrible because we had this title fight about a week ago. It ended in completely anticlimactic fashion. It left everything in a state of chaos and uncertainty because you've got Van, who, because of the way he won, winning by injury so early in the fight, isn't like a clear deserving champion. He isn't the clear best flyweight in the world. And Pantoja, while he didn't actually lose his belt in any meaningful way, did nevertheless lose it officially. And with his age and the injury, you have to wonder if he can come back looking as good as he was prior. So again, everything's kind of up in the air. And ordinarily that'd be bad, but I actually think the flyweight division is in a better place right now today than it was before that title fight. And that's largely due to a combination of other flyweight fights that happened on that card and in the card this weekend. Because on the first card, you had Tyra beating Moreno. And that fight by itself, could be enough to get him a title shot. Under ordinary circumstances, finishing Moreno would be enough. You also had Horiguchi making his return. And for those of you who don't know, he's been around a long time. He was very young and he got a title shot against Demetrius Johnson, lost. Went on to win some good fights after, beat guys like Bagutinov, was either cut from the UFC or left. I don't know the details, can't remember. But he left the UFC on a winning streak. And he went on to just clean house in organizations like Ryzen and Bellator. He traded wins with guys like Sergio Pettis, guys like Kaya Sakura, who of course came to the UFC and fought Pantoja, was one of his title defenses. Horiguchi is a very good fighter, and he came back, he made his return fight, took on a Dagestani guy from Team Khabib, finished him, looked amazing. He could get a title shot too, just on merit, I think. And then, of course, Manel Kape. He won this weekend, got another finish. And what's great about this situation is it's all fresh matchups for Van because he's effectively only fought Royval. He's the only guy at the top of the division who Van has fought. Because even though Van fought Pantoja, if they have a rematch, it'll effectively be just a new fight, a fresh matchup, because the first fight was so short and so inconclusive. So really, everyone at the top of the division is just fresh for him, and that's great. Pantoja was starting to run into that problem like Merab was running into, where he'd kind of cleared out the top of the division. There wasn't a lot of fresh stuff. Yeah, some of these fights would be new, like Horiguchi would be new, and Tyra would be new, so just having those guys in the mix is great. But he'd already fought Kape, and if he would have beaten Van, then Van would have been out of the way. And so he's already fought Royval, he's already fought Moreno. It was getting stale. But now it's all fresh. Now it's all up in the air. And an additional layer of intrigue is the fact that we have two Japanese fighters who are arguably top contenders. Because bear in mind, despite the fact that Japan is one of the most important countries in the world in terms of martial arts and in terms of combat sports, and despite the fact that Japan has played this pivotal role in the MMA world with creating promotions like Pride FC and Ryzen, et cetera, despite all that, we've never had a Japanese UFC champion. And to my knowledge, the only people who've even fought for it are Horiguchi the first time when he fought Mighty Mouse, and Yushin Okami when he fought Anderson Silva, and I can't think of any other examples. So that's strangely rare. And, I can think of, examples maybe in Strikeforce and stuff like that of Japanese fighters fighting for belts, but not, again, in the UFC, those are the only two that come to mind. And right now we've got two flyweights who are both Japanese and are both deserving of title shots and could potentially win. I could see either of those guys beating Van. Not that Van isn't great, but he's not immortal. He hasn't shown that he's the top dog yet. He's in a worse spot than Jack Della Maddalena was in when he beat Bilal. Because if you watched all my coverage of his fight leading up to his fight with Islam, I said many times that he wasn't clearly the best welterweight in the world, even though he was the legitimate champion, and he did legitimately beat Bilal. Bilal himself wasn't clearly the best welterweight in the world either. And it's very much the case that Van is not clearly the best flyweight, because again, the only fucking guy he's beaten is Royval. And just look at what Kape did to Royval. You know what I mean? So it's this is all fresh, this is all fun, and this is a good place to be. And by extension, I feel like a lot of the divisions are experiencing good turnover like this at the moment, because let's just go through the list. I just covered flyweight. Bantamweight was one of the worst divisions in terms of the champion just clearing it out. He was just lapping. Merab was just rematching everyone at this point. But now that Jan has won, it's all exciting again. If O'Malley can beat Sang Yadong, we all would like to see O'Malley and Jan rematch. We'd like to see Jan get that one back. More than anything, I'd like to see Jan fight Umar, which is a fresh matchup. And even the trilogy fight between him and Dvalishvili, that would not be boring. That wouldn't just feel like, that would feel a lot more interesting than the rematch was going into it, where it just felt like a given that Merab was going to win. It just felt like him lapping the division because he wanted to stay active, and that was all there was to it. But now a trilogy fight, that means a lot more. And so that's a good place for him. Featherweight, less so. Like, Volk is wasting time fighting Lopez again. He really just has the one excellent contender in Evloev, whom the UFC refuses to give a shot. So that's too bad. But lightweight, very interesting. Hopefully Topuria fucking comes back and gets his fucking personal shit settled. But, like, he hasn't fought anybody. All he's fought is Charles. He's fought Oliveira too, but down at featherweight. But, he hasn't fought Gaethje. He hasn't fought Paddy. He hasn't fought Arman, most importantly. Like, all sorts of fresh stuff there. Welterweight, one of the best. Islam, totally new. He hasn't fought Shavkat. He hasn't fought Gary. Like, he hasn't fought Morales. And Amislav just made his debut this weekend. He was the Bellator champion, a Ukrainian guy. Excellent fighter, absolutely excellent grappling. And he came and he smashed Neil Magny. He submitted him with an anaconda choke in the first round. I'd love to see that guy take on the top of the division. I'd love to see him fight Kamaru Usman, fight Shavkat, fight Gary, and fight Islam. Like, this is all great. This is just a very lively division at the moment. And same with middleweight. I feel like it's a little more depressing with middleweight because we feel like Chimaev can just do what he did to Duplessis to everyone and be inactive and all that kind of shit. So, like, there's more reason for pessimism there. But at least in terms of matchups, like, he's got Imanov, he's got Fluffy Hernandez, he's got Brendan Allen. Like, he's got guys to fight. Maybe Rainer de Ritter makes a comeback. He did the same thing Merab did. He fought like 4 or 5 times in a year. Like, maybe he was just burnt out. Maybe that explains his bad performance. Maybe he fights Dricus in the meantime and wins and looks great again and gets a title shot. I'd be interested to see that. It's really light heavyweight and heavyweight where it's kind of the worst. There's not a lot of people for Alex to fight. There's not a lot of people for Tom to fight. And those divisions just haven't, looked great. There hasn't been a lot of activity at the highest level, Here and there, we saw Jiri beat Khalil Roundtree, and that was a great fight, of course. We just saw Jan, have a very cool kind of moral victory in a draw the other week. But, like, those divisions, whatever. Light heavyweight and heavyweight haven't been good since, like, 2006 anyways. But in any case, most of the divisions, interesting new champions, mixed with, like, a crop of legitimate contenders where you have too many, where it's like any one of them on their own deserve it, but it's a question of amongst them who deserves it. Who's the best of the best amongst this crop of contenders, and do you make them all fight each other or what? Like, how do you play that out? But that's a good problem to have. It's like having too much money. And Flyweight has joined that conversation where, again, just 2 weeks ago, it was going the route of bantamweight, where it's like, oh, the champions beat everyone. He's got maybe one contender or something, and that's it. Not that interesting. Now, boom, everything's fresh. So again, Van hasn't fought anyone. He's fought Royval, and that's it. And he's 24, 25 years old. Plenty of time to improve. Plenty of time to have a long streak of title defenses, maybe. Who knows? He could kind of, find himself in like a young Jose Aldo position. Who's to say? So it's all very intriguing. I can't wait to see it. Again, even just that little tidbit of, like, could we see our first Japanese UFC champion? That'd be cool. That'd be interesting. I don't care that much, but it'd be interesting. I think it's a good spot to be. And I like the UFC did a good job this year, or rather, like, this last half of the year, where they took top contender fights and, like, situated them around title fights of the same division. So you had Chimaev fight Dricus, and around that you had guys like Fluffy Hernandez and Imanov fighting. You had and de Ritter and guys like that. Like, those guys all fought around that same time. You had Islam fight JDM, and around the same time you had Ian Gary fight. You had Morales fight. You just had Pantoja and Van fight, and around that time you had Taira and Horiguchi and Kopp. You had all those guys fight around the same time, which not only, like, just sends the message home and has us all associating the right people with the right people, but also kind of gets them on the right schedule, where it's like, if you're all fighting around the same time, you should all be able to return around the same time. You know, it's just a good way to do things. And it reminds me of a time, the card itself didn't pan out as well as it could have, but they did this with heavyweight back in like 2011 or so, where they had a pay-per-view and it was an all heavyweight pay-per-view. And this is back when the heavyweight division was actually still pretty good. So like that, some people will hear an all heavyweight pay-per-view and just be like, oh my God, that sounds like the worst shit ever. But it was going to be Overeem versus Junior Dos Santos for the belt. This was after Overeem made his debut and like smoked Brock Lesnar. It ended up not happening because Overeem popped for drugs. But at the time, this was like the biggest fight possible, Overeem and Dos Santos. And the co-main event was going to be Frank Mir, Cain Velasquez, and then it was going to be some combination of like, it was going to be like Bigfoot, Roy Nelson. It was going to be Gonzaga versus somebody. There was another one and it all got shuffled because once Overeem popped, Mir got the title shot, and then Bigfoot fought Cain, and then everything else got shuffled. So the card itself didn't end up as good as it was initially supposed to be. The title fight didn't end up as good as it was initially supposed to be. But it was still a pretty decent card, and it was just cool to have a theme like that. Like, I would like to see that in a better division. Like, how cool would it be to see, like, Ilya Topuria defend his belt against Arman or Patty or whoever the fuck, and then just have the other lightweights, just have, like, top 12 lightweights line the rest of the pay-per-view. Just have, like, Dan Hooker fighting Hanato Moicano, and have, you know, if Ilya's fighting Arman, then have Patty fighting Gaethje, which, you know, I know is coming up, but like in an alternate world, like Patty's fighting Gaethje in the co-main event, Hooker's fighting Moicano, Saint Denis is fighting Oliveira, you know, whatever, like just a line of like a lineup on the card like that, where it's just ranked flyweights all the way through. Be fucking great. And I'll settle for the in-between, where you just get a couple fights like that, where again, like you had Pantoja fighting Van, and you had Tyra fighting Moreno on the same card, on the same, not just card, but on the main card. That's fantastic. Like, that's good booking. So, ending the year a bit as far as like covering the UFC events and the recent fights, like on a bit of a high note here, where I'm feeling pretty good about most of these divisions. Sure, we had some sour notes. You know, we had the whole fucking Aspinall Gane situation. You know, John Jones won't fucking go away. We've got Alex Pereira in a bit of limbo because other than going up to heavyweight, he hasn't got a lot to do. And Tom having this shit with Gane kind of throws a wrench in him going up. So it's just, yeah, stuff like that to be sad about. You know, Chimaev having a boring ass fight with Duplessis, something to be sad about. But on the whole, I would say the male divisions are looking very, very good at the moment. So, you know, count your blessings, I guess.